The air was cold and dry, biting at Chase's exposed skin as he shut the door of his camper. Night had fallen quickly, as if winter itself had decided to wrap the mountains in an impenetrable shroud of darkness. It was barely 6 in the evening, but there wasn't a trace of light left. Only the moon, hidden behind a blanket of clouds, and his flashlight illuminated the surroundings. It had been another silent day. Chase's routine was simple: chop firewood, check the water supply, make sure his hunting rifle was in good condition. Since deciding to leave society behind and move to the mountains, he'd found a certain kind of peace. Away from people, away from the noise. Despite the cold and the isolation, he felt more alive than ever. The camper was his refuge. Though old and battered, he had spent months fixing it up before starting this journey. The propane stove kept the interior tolerable, and a couple of thick blankets were all he needed to face the freezing nights. But there was something in the air tonight that made him uneasy. As he prepared a cup of hot coffee in the tiny kitchen, his thoughts drifted to the tracks he'd found earlier that morning. About 2 kilometers from his camper, near a frozen stream, he'd seen something he couldn't quite explain. At first glance, the marks looked like those of a coyote: 4 paws, visible claws. But the shape was strange, as if the animal had walked in an irregular manner, dragging its hind legs. Some tracks were larger, others deeper, as though the creature had shifted its weight, or its form, midway.
Probably just an injured animal,
he muttered to himself as he poured the coffee into an old metal mug. Still, something didn't add up. The tracks didn't follow a logical pattern. They were erratic, as if the animal had walked in circles before disappearing into the trees. Chase had spent enough time in the mountains to recognize the trails of common predators. This was different. Taking a sip of his coffee, a distant howl pierced the silence. Chase froze, his hand suspended midair. Hearing coyotes at night wasn't unusual, but this sound was strange. It was high-pitched, like the cry of an animal in agony, and much closer than he'd expected.
"Damn coyotes!"
he said, trying to convince himself there was nothing to worry about. He moved to one of the camper's windows and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, the mist was starting to thicken, rising from the ground like an ominous tide. The light from his lantern, hanging near the camper door, barely penetrated the haze. He saw nothing, but the howl came again, this time joined by another, and then another. A chorus of coyotes, far too close for comfort.
"This isn't good,"
he thought, reaching for the rifle resting by the door. He checked to make sure it was loaded and grabbed his handheld flashlight. Chase wasn't one to panic, but something deep inside urged him to stay alert. Coyotes typically avoided humans, especially if they smelled fire or heard noise. So why were they so close? Carefully, he opened the camper door, letting the icy night air hit him full force. His breath turned to vapor, mingling with the mist as he shone the flashlight toward the trees. Everything was quiet now. Too quiet.
"Hello?"
he called out, feeling a bit foolish. He knew he wouldn't get an answer, but the sound of his own voice brought some comfort. He stepped a few paces out of the camper, sweeping the flashlight from side to side. The shadows of the trees danced in strange shapes under the beam. There were no signs of the coyotes, or any other animals. But the overwhelming sensation of being watched was impossible to ignore. A faint crackling sound came from his left. Chase spun around, aiming the rifle, but all he saw were broken branches and fallen leaves. The howl came again, this time from behind him. When he turned, what he saw made him freeze. At the edge of the mist, barely visible in the flashlight's beam, stood a figure. It looked like a coyote, but something was wrong. It was too large, its limbs bent at unnatural angles. The creature didn't move, it just stood there, staring at him with glowing eyes that reflected the light. A chill ran down Chase's spine. He took a step back, and the creature moved too, but toward him. Instinctively, he raised the rifle and aimed. But by the time he pulled the trigger, the creature was gone, melting into the mist as if it had never been there. The gunshot echoed through the mountains, but no other sounds followed. Only the furious pounding of his heart and the ragged sound of his breathing filled the air. He retreated to the camper, locking the door and pulling all the curtains shut. That night, he couldn't sleep. Outside, the coyotes kept howling. Dawn arrived slowly, seeping through the mist that blanketed the mountains like a shroud. Chase had spent the night sitting by the camper window, his rifle resting on his knees and an unlit flashlight in his hand. The howls of the coyotes had finally died away in the early hours of the morning, but the silence that followed was even more oppressive. The gray light of day revealed scratch marks on the camper door. They weren't deep, but they were enough to leave visible traces. Chase ran his fingers over them, trying to determine whether they'd been made by the coyotes or something else. The memory of the creature he had seen the previous night hit him like a blow to the chest. He couldn't shake those glowing eyes or the way its limbs seemed to bend unnaturally. The camper was his refuge. Though old and battered, he had spent months fixing it up before starting this journey. The propane stove kept the interior tolerable, and a couple of thick blankets were all he needed to face the freezing nights. But there was something in the air tonight that made him uneasy.
This isn't normal,
he muttered to himself, gathering his backpack and a few tools. He needed answers. Chase decided to head out and investigate the area. He knew something had happened nearby, and he couldn't just sit around waiting for the creature to return. He loaded his rifle, stuffed extra ammunition into his jacket pocket, and secured a knife to his belt. The cold was biting, and the mist still clung to the ground, but Chase couldn't afford to wait. He walked to the spot where he had fired his rifle the previous night. The snow on the ground was trampled, but not by human footprints. The marks were large, irregular, and seemed to shift in shape as they progressed. Some were deep, as though something heavy had landed there, while others were lighter and elongated, almost like deformed hands rather than paws. Chase followed the tracks for several meters until they led to the edge of a clearing. There, they stopped abruptly. The snow beyond was untouched, as if the creature had simply vanished into thin air.
Damn coyotes!
He whispered, a shiver running down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. He turned slowly, scanning his surroundings. The mist still hung in the air, and the trees bordering the clearing cast long, twisted shadows. Every snap of a branch, every rustle of wind through the leaves, made him tense. There were no clear signs of the creature, but the sensation of being watched was suffocating. As he inspected the area, Chase discovered something even more unsettling, a tuft of fur caught in the low branches of a bush. It was pitch black, coarse and rough to the touch, almost like bristles. When he held it up to the light, he could see it was stained with something dark and dried. Blood.
This can't be a coyote!
He said aloud, trying to quell the knot forming in his stomach. He tucked the tuft of fur into his backpack and retraced his steps. Each time he encountered one of those misshapen tracks, the air seemed to grow heavier, as if something unseen were stalking him. When he finally returned to his camper, he was met with a chilling sight. In the snow, right in front of the door, was a fresh set of tracks. These were even larger and more defined than the ones he had been following. They seemed to have appeared while he was away and ended at the step leading to his camper. It was as though the creature had been waiting for him. A surge of anger and fear welled up inside Chase. He was being hunted. He decided to fortify the camper, using whatever he could find, planks, nails, even an old chain he had been saving. That night, he made sure to keep every light inside the camper off. If the creature came back, he wouldn't give it any clues to his location. As the hours crept by, the cold grew harsher. Chase sat on the floor, his rifle slung over his shoulder and his backpack by his side. The night felt like a silent trap, and the distant echoes of coyote howls returned, fainter this time, but no less unsettling. Suddenly, a dull thud came from the back of the camper. Then another, as if something were testing the structure. Chase shot to his feet, quickly extinguishing his flashlight, and waited in the darkness. The sound stopped, and for a moment, he thought it might have just been the wind. But then, a slow, deliberate scratching sound ran along the exterior wall, making every hair on his body stand on end. The creature was back. The night was an endless abyss, broken only by the relentless pounding against the camper's walls. Chase, gripping his rifle tightly, moved silently toward one of the side windows, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever was outside. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air, and his heart pounded like a drum in the darkness. The scratching came again, this time from the roof. Chase aimed his flashlight upward, but the camper's metal ceiling revealed nothing. The sound moved slowly and deliberately, as if the creature were exploring the structure, searching for its weakest point. Finally, a powerful thud shook the entire vehicle, making it sway. Chase couldn't wait any longer. Taking a deep breath, he shoved the door open and stepped into the brutal cold. The mist was still thick, but his flashlight cut through it, illuminating the figure perched atop the camper. The creature stared down at him, and Chase felt a chill crawl up his spine. It resembled an enormous coyote, but its limbs were twisted and elongated, with jagged branches and thorns protruding from its skin. The creature leapt from the roof with unnatural grace, landing in front of him. Chase stepped back, raising his rifle. The beast didn't attack immediately, it simply watched him, tilting its head as if studying him. Chase pulled the trigger, and the shot echoed into the night. The impact forced the creature to stagger, but it didn't fall. Dark liquid oozed from its side, but the wound only seemed to enrage it. With a guttural roar, it lunged at Chase, who barely managed to dodge the first strike. He hit the ground, rolling as he scrambled to reload his rifle with trembling hands. The fight was brutal. Every shot Chase managed to land slowed the creature but didn't stop it. At last, his final bullet struck true, hitting the beast square in the head. With a guttural, wrenching growl, it collapsed. The echo of the shot faded, leaving only silence in the mountain air. Chase remained still for a moment, breathing heavily. He stared at the creature's lifeless body, making sure it wouldn't rise again. His mind was reeling, unable to fully comprehend what he had just faced. But the threat was over. As dawn broke, the mist began to lift. Exhausted and injured, Chase made the decision to leave the mountains behind. He packed what little he could carry into his backpack, abandoning the camper. There was no time for explanations and no energy left to seek answers about the creature. Days later, a group of hikers stumbled upon the abandoned camper. The door was open, and inside they found only the remnants of a life interrupted, an empty coffee cup, disheveled blankets, and an empty rifle. Outside, the deformed tracks surrounding the camper told a story no one could explain. Chase was never seen again. Some say he managed to escape, leaving the mountains behind for good. Others believe the creature wasn't alone and that it eventually caught up to him. But one thing is certain, the mountains hold secrets best left undisturbed.